There I was, sitting alone in Terminal B at Denver International Airport at 6 a.m., abandoned by my own adult children with nothing but a useless boarding pass and the slowly dawning realization that the people I had sacrificed everything for had just shown me exactly what they thought I was worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's what my daughter Linda and my son Robert didn't know when they abandoned me at that gate, thinking they'd taught me a lesson about being too dependent on the family. I wasn't just some helpless 70-year-old they could manipulate and discard. I was a woman who had been quietly building her financial independence for months, had substantial savings they knew nothing about, excellent credit, and was about to turn their cruel teaching moment into the most liberating first-class adventure of my life, while they were stuck explaining to extended family why Grandma Eleanor mysteriously couldn't make it to my great-niece's destination wedding in Costa Rica. Let me tell you how I went from abandoned elderly burden to living my best. Life at 30,000 feet, sipping champagne in first class while they dealt with the consequences of their calculated cruelty. The cold, sterile terminal felt like a tomb at 6 a.m., The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting that sickly yellow glow that makes everyone look like they're dying. A few early morning travelers shuffled past with their coffee and carry-on bags, completely unaware that my entire world had just imploded right there at Gate B27. I kept staring at my phone, rereading the text message that had shattered everything. I thought I knew about my children. Mom, we decided you need to learn some independence. Consider this a reality check. The return ticket home is in your name. Figure it out yourself. Maybe this will teach you that the world doesn't revolve around you. At 70, it's time you learn to handle things on your own. Linda. The message had come through at 3:47 a.m., exactly 13 minutes after their flight to San Jose had taken off. 13 minutes after I'd spent 45 minutes frantically searching the airport for them, thinking there had been some terrible misunderstanding. 13 minutes after I'd begged airport security to help me find my lost family, only to be told that sometimes families have disputes and there wasn't much they could do. I remember the exact moment I realized what had happened. I was standing at the departure gate watching the last passengers board the plane to Costa Rica when the gate agent looked at me with pity and said, "Ma'am, that flight is now closed. The manifest shows 4 passengers from the Thompson family checked in, but only 3 boarded. Are you the 4th? 4 passengers, 3 boarded. My daughter Linda, my son Robert, and Robert's wife Carol had all made it onto that plane. But somehow, mysteriously, I had been left behind. That's when I understood. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a miscommunication. This was deliberate. They had planned this. As I sat there in that uncomfortable airport chair, my mind raced through the events of the past 24 hours, looking for clues I should have seen. How could I have been so blind? At 70 years old, after raising these children, sacrificing for them, supporting them through every crisis of their adult lives, how had I missed the signs that they saw me as nothing more than a burden to be managed? The flight confirmation they'd sent me had a different departure time than theirs, 6:30 a.m. instead of 3:30 a.m. When I'd questioned it, Linda had rolled her eyes and said, "Mom, you're always so paranoid about details. The travel agent must have made a mistake. Just show up when your ticket says to show up." The transportation arrangements that had mysteriously fallen through at the last minute. "No big deal," Robert had said cheerfully. "We'll take 2 cars. Mom, you can handle getting yourself there, right? You keep saying you want more independence." The group text that had gone suspiciously quiet after they'd arrived at the airport. I'd sent a dozen messages asking where they were, what gate, were they through security yet? Radio silence. Even their luggage situation made sense now. Carol had insisted I pack light, because we'll all be sharing taxis and shuttles in Costa Rica. Meanwhile, I'd noticed Linda stuffing her suitcase with enough clothes for 2 weeks, not the 4-day trip we'd supposedly planned. Every single detail had been orchestrated to ensure I'd arrive at the airport after they were gone, with a useless ticket that would get me exactly nowhere. But why? What had I done to deserve this level of calculated cruelty from my own children? Sitting there in the terminal, I started connecting dots I'd been ignoring for years. This wasn't the first time my adult children had decided I needed to be taught a lesson. It was just the most elaborate and cruel version of a pattern that had been developing since my husband Harold died 3 years ago. When Harold passed away from cancer after a long illness, I had expected my children to be supportive during my grief and adjustment to widowhood. Instead, they seemed irritated by my sadness and impatient with my need for emotional support. "Mom, you need to start building a life for yourself," Linda had said just 2 months after Harold's funeral, when I'd called crying because the house felt so empty. "You can't depend on us to be your entire social circle." When I'd mentioned feeling lonely and maybe wanting to move closer to one of them, Robert's response was swift and harsh. "Mom, Carol and I have our own lives to manage. We can't take on the responsibility of entertaining you all the time." When I'd struggled with learning new technology after Harold died, he had always handled our computers and smartphones. Their reaction wasn't patience and teaching, but exasperation and judgment. "Mom, you're 70, not 90, Linda had snapped when I'd asked for help setting up online banking. "You need to learn these things yourself instead of expecting other people to do everything for you." Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering had become an opportunity for them to point out ways I was too dependent, or not adapting well to widowhood, or expecting too much from family. But here's what they never acknowledged. I had been Harold's caregiver for 2 years during his illness. I had managed his medications, his doctor appointments, his insurance claims, and his daily care while also maintaining our household, our finances, and my own health. I had demonstrated more independence and capability during those 2 years than most people show in a decade. Yet somehow, after his death, I had become the helpless widow who needed constant lessons in self-reliance. As I sat there processing my abandonment, my phone started ringing. The first call was from my sister Margaret, who lived in Florida and had been planning to video call during the wedding reception to see everyone. "Eleanor, honey, where are you? I just talked to Linda, and she said you decided at the last minute that you couldn't handle the travel and had canceled your trip. She seemed very concerned about your emotional state." My stomach dropped. They weren't just covering their tracks, they were actively lying to the family about why I wasn't there. They were making me look like the unstable one who had let everyone down. "Margaret, I didn't cancel anything. I'm at the Denver airport because Linda and Robert left me here on purpose." The silence on the other end was deafening. When my sister finally spoke, her voice was tight with anger. "What do you mean they left you there on purpose?" I explained the whole situation. The different flight times, the separate transportation, the radio silence, the text message. As I talked, I could hear Margaret's breathing getting sharper. "Eleanor, I've been worried about how your children treat you since Harold died. This is absolutely unacceptable. What do you need? Do you need money for a flight? Do you need me to call them and give them a piece of my mind?" The second call came from my great-niece Sarah, the bride herself. "Great-aunt Eleanor, I can't wait. To see you tonight? I know the travel is complicated at your age, but I'm so grateful you decided to come anyway. This is going to be the best weekend ever." I started crying before I could stop myself. Here was this sweet girl, excited to have her great-aunt at her wedding, completely unaware that my own children had sabotaged my attendance. "Sarah, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I'm not going to make it." "What?" "Great-aunt Eleanor, what's wrong? Are you okay? How do you explain to a bride on her wedding weekend that your own adult children have abandoned you as some kind of twisted life lesson? How do you dump that kind of family drama on someone who should be thinking about nothing but happiness and celebration?" I'm stuck at the airport in Denver. There was a miscommunication about flights. A miscommunication? But Cousin Linda just told my mom that you decided the travel was too stressful and felt it was better to stay home. She said you were worried about your health and didn't want to risk the international travel. More lies. They weren't just covering their tracks. They were actively destroying my reputation with the extended family, making me look like a frail, anxious elderly woman who couldn't handle basic travel. Sarah, that's not true. I've been looking forward to your wedding for months. I bought a mother of the bride outfit. I've had my hair done. I was so excited to dance at your reception. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Sarah wasn't stupid, and she knew family dynamics well enough to read between the lines. Great Aunt Eleanor, did they leave you there on purpose? I think so. Those absolute bastards. Sarah's voice was quiet but furious. Great Aunt Eleanor, I'm going to fix this. Let me call the travel agent and get you on the next flight out. This is my wedding weekend, and I want you here. After I hung up with Sarah, promising her I'd figure something out, I sat back in that uncomfortable airport chair and felt something shift inside me. The tears stopped. The panic subsided. And for the first time since Harold's death, I saw my family situation with complete clarity. This wasn't about teaching me independence. This wasn't about helping me grow as a person. This was about control, manipulation, and a sick need to keep me feeling small and grateful for whatever scraps of attention they chose to give me. They wanted me to call them, crying and begging, asking them to fix what they'd broken. They wanted me to learn that I couldn't survive without them, that I needed their help and guidance for everything. They expected me to use the return ticket they'd graciously provided, fly home with my tail between my legs, and thank them for the learning experience. They thought they knew exactly who I was, the helpless elderly widow who couldn't handle real life without constant supervision and correction. But here's what they didn't know about me, what I'd been carefully hiding from them for months. I wasn't that person anymore. While my children had been treating me like a fragile, dependent elderly woman who needed constant guidance, I'd been quietly rebuilding a life they knew nothing about. A life that was about to become my salvation. 6 months after Harold's death, when the worst of my grief had passed, I had done something I'd never told my children about. I had hired a financial advisor and completely reorganized my finances. Harold had always handled our money, and after his death, I discovered that we were actually in much better financial shape than I'd realized. Between his pension, Social Security, life insurance, and our investments, I had substantial assets that could support a very comfortable lifestyle. But instead of celebrating this financial security with my children, I'd kept it to myself. Because every time I'd mentioned having money in the past, they'd found ways to suggest I should be spending it on them or their children. When I'd mentioned that Harold's life insurance payout was more than expected, Linda had immediately started talking about how expensive her daughter's college tuition was going to be. When I'd said I was thinking about renovating the kitchen, Robert had suggested I should help him and Carol with their mortgage instead. So I'd learned to keep my financial situation private, while they continued to treat me like I was living on a fixed income and needed their financial guidance. 3 months ago, I'd made another decision they knew nothing about. I had started working with a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and grief counseling. Dr. Patricia Williams had been helping me understand that my children's treatment of me wasn't normal concern. It was a pattern of emotional manipulation designed to keep me feeling dependent and grateful. Eleanor, she'd said during one of our sessions, healthy adult children support their widowed parent through grief and adjustment. They don't create additional stress by criticizing every coping mechanism and decision. She'd helped me recognize that I wasn't too needy or not adjusting well. I was having a normal grief response while being emotionally undermined by the people who should have been supporting me. And just last month, I'd been researching solo travel options for seniors. After years of Harold handling all our travel planning, I'd been teaching myself to navigate booking flights, researching destinations, and planning itineraries. I'd been saving up for a solo trip to Europe, something I'd always wanted to do, but Harold had never been interested in. I'd been planning to surprise my children with the news that I was taking an independent vacation, to show them that I was more capable than they gave me credit for. Sitting in that airport terminal, I realized that everything I needed to turn this nightmare into an opportunity was already in place. I had money saved. I had excellent credit. I had research on destinations and travel planning. And most importantly, I had nowhere I needed to be except wherever I decided to go. My children thought they'd trapped me with their cruel little lesson. Instead, they'd given me the perfect excuse to do something I'd been secretly planning anyway. Prove to myself that I could not only survive without their approval, but thrive. As I sat there formulating my plan, I decided to document what was happening. My granddaughter Melissa had recently taught me how to use TikTok, and I'd been quietly building a small following by sharing cooking tips and stories about life as a widow. I opened the app and started recording a video, not really sure what I was going to say, but feeling like I needed to capture this moment. Hello everyone, it's Eleanor, and I'm sitting alone at Denver Airport at 6:30 a.m. because my adult children just abandoned me here as some kind of life lesson. They flew to Costa Rica without me and left me a text message saying I need to learn independence. I showed the camera the text message, the useless boarding pass, the empty terminal around me. So you know what? They're right. I do need to learn independence. I need to learn that I don't need people who treat me like a burden. I need to learn that at 70 years old, I'm still capable of amazing things when I'm not constantly being told I'm too old or too fragile. I paused, looking directly into the camera. My children think they're teaching me that I can't survive without them. They're about to learn that I can't just survive without them. I can have the adventure of a lifetime. I posted the video without really thinking about it, then immediately started researching flights on my phone. Where did I want to go? What had I always dreamed of doing but never thought I could manage? The comments on my TikTok started rolling in immediately. Hundreds of people sharing their own stories of family manipulation, offering support, and cheering me on to live my best life and show them what they lost. But one comment stopped me in my tracks. Eleanor, honey, book yourself a first-class ticket somewhere amazing and document the whole trip. Show them what they're missing while they're dealing with the drama they created. First class. I'd never flown first class in my life. Harold had always insisted it was a waste of money, and that coach builds character. Even when we'd taken trips for our anniversary or special occasions, we'd always flown the cheapest possible option, because travel is about the destination, not the journey. But I had my secret savings account. I had excellent credit. And I had absolutely nothing to lose. I opened the airline app on my phone and started browsing destinations. Where did I want to go? What adventure did I want to have while my children were busy explaining to Sarah why her great-aunt had mysteriously disappeared? Italy? I'd always wanted to see the art museums of Florence and the canals of Venice, but Harold had always said European travel was too complicated for people our age. Japan? The cherry blossoms and traditional culture had fascinated me for years, but my children had always dismissed my interest as impractical, given the language barrier and cultural differences, or I could really make a statement and go somewhere absolutely incredible, somewhere that would make it crystal clear that their lesson had backfired spectacularly. That's when I saw it, a first-class seat to Paris, departing in 4 hours. Paris had been my dream destination since I was a young woman. I'd studied French in high school and college. I'd always been fascinated by the art and culture, and I'd dreamed of seeing the Louvre, the Eiffel Tower, and the charming cafes I'd read about in books. Harold had never been interested in France. Too snooty, he'd always said, and too expensive. My children had inherited his dismissive attitude toward my interests, often rolling their eyes when I mentioned wanting to visit European museums or experience different cultures. The first class ticket was expensive, more than I'd ever spent on anything for myself in my life. But as I looked at my savings account balance, I realized I could afford it. Not only could I afford it, but I'd been unconsciously saving for exactly this kind of moment without even realizing it. Every dollar I'd saved by cooking at home instead of going to restaurants where my children criticized my food choices. Every vacation I'd skipped because they said I should stay local and not overextend myself. Every experience I'd denied myself because they convinced me it was too expensive or not appropriate for someone my age. It had all been leading to this moment. I was about to book the ticket when my phone rang again. It was Linda. "Mom, I just wanted to check that you got my message and you're handling the return flight okay." Her voice was casual, almost bored, like she was calling to discuss the weather. No apology, no concern, no acknowledgement that what they'd done was cruel and unusual. "Oh, I got the message," I said calmly. "I'm handling the situation just fine." "Good. Robert and I were worried you might overreact or something. You know how you can be when things don't go according to plan. How I can be. Right. The woman who had managed Harold's care through terminal cancer was apparently someone who couldn't handle change. Linda, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "How long have you all been planning this?" There was a pause, and I could practically hear her deciding whether to keep lying or just admit it. "Mom, look, we all agreed that you needed a wake-up call. You're 70 years old, and you still act like we're going to handle everything for you forever. This seemed like a good opportunity to help you grow up a little. Help me grow up. At 70 years old, by abandoning me at an airport and lying to Sarah. About why I'm not there? Was that part of helping me grow up too?" Another pause. "We didn't want to make the wedding weekend about your drama. My drama. The drama they had created by leaving me stranded. Well, Linda, you'll be happy to know that your plan worked perfectly. I am definitely learning independence. In fact, I'm about to be more independent than you could possibly imagine." "What do you mean?" I clicked purchase on the first-class ticket to Paris. "It means I hope you have a wonderful time explaining to Sarah and the rest of the family why I'm not there. Because I'm going to be busy having the adventure of a lifetime." I hung up and immediately posted another TikTok. Update, just booked. A first-class ticket to Paris. Thanks for the life lesson, kids. I'm about to learn that I don't just not need you. I'm better off without you. The adventure was about to begin, and for the first time since Harold's death, I was about to discover who I really was when nobody was watching over my shoulder, waiting for me to fail. My children wanted to teach me independence? Perfect. They were about to get a masterclass in what that actually looked like. As I sat there waiting for my boarding call, watching the sunrise through the terminal windows, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pure, unadulterated excitement about my own life. For 70 years, I'd been living my life according to other people's expectations and limitations. I'd been the dutiful daughter, the supportive wife, the grateful mother who never took risks or made impulsive decisions because I was too busy trying to earn approval that was never going to come. But in a few hours, I'd be on a plane to Paris, sitting in first class, about to embark on a solo adventure that would either prove I could handle anything life threw at me, or teach me something valuable about my own capabilities. Either way, I'd be learning it on my own terms, not as part of some cruel lesson designed to make me feel small and dependent. My phone buzzed with notifications. My TikTok videos were going viral, with thousands of comments from people cheering me on, sharing their own stories of family dysfunction, and begging for updates on my Paris adventure. I was no longer just Eleanor Thompson, the disappointing mother who needed constant correction and guidance. I was about to become Eleanor Thompson, the 70-year-old woman who turned family abandonment into the greatest adventure of her life. And the best part? While I was discovering the Louvre, strolling along the Seine, and eating incredible food in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, my children would be spending their Costa Rica vacation dealing with the fallout from their decision to leave me behind. They thought they were teaching me that I couldn't survive without them. They were about to learn that I couldn't just survive without them. I could flourish. The boarding call for my flight to Paris echoed through the terminal, and as I gathered my purse and walked toward the gate, I felt like I was walking toward a completely new version of myself. My children had given me the gift of abandonment. I was about to turn it into the gift of freedom. Walking toward Gate A12. For my first-class flight to Paris, I felt like I was shedding a skin I'd been forced to wear for 3 years. But here's what my adult children still didn't understand. What they had never bothered to learn about me in all their years of helping me adjust to widowhood. The woman boarding that plane wasn't the helpless, dependent elderly widow they thought they were disciplining. I had been quietly building a completely separate life, a financially secure and emotionally independent life, right under their noses. For the past 18 months, I had been living what amounted to a double life. While they saw me as the struggling widow who needed constant guidance and supervision, the reality was that I had been systematically preparing for independence in ways they couldn't have imagined. My financial situation wasn't just stable, it was extraordinary. When Harold died, I had been afraid to look at our finances. He had always handled the money, and I'd assumed we were living paycheck to paycheck on his modest engineer's salary. But when I finally worked up the courage to meet with a financial advisor 6 months after his death, I discovered something shocking. Harold had been far more financially savvy than I'd ever known. Our investment portfolio was worth $847,000. His pension had survivor benefits that would pay me $3,200 per month for life. His life insurance had paid out $300,000. Social Security added another $2,100 per month. Our house was completely paid, often worth approximately $450,000. I was not a poor widow scraping by on a fixed income. I was a millionaire, but I had made a conscious decision to keep this information from my children. Why? Because every time I'd mentioned having any money in the past, they'd found ways to suggest I should be spending it on them or their families. When I'd casually mentioned that Harold had left me comfortable, Linda had immediately started talking about how expensive her son's orthodontic treatment was going to be. When I'd said I was thinking about renovating the bathroom, Robert had suggested I should help him and Carol with their credit card debt instead. "Mom," Linda had said, during one particularly memorable conversation, "you don't need a fancy bathroom at your age. But Jake really needs those braces and we're struggling with the payments." "Mom," Robert had added, "you should think about moving to a smaller place anyway. This house is too big for one person, and the maintenance is probably overwhelming." They hadn't been asking for help. They'd been telling me how I should spend my money while simultaneously convincing me that I was incapable of making good financial decisions on my own. So I'd learned to live modestly, publicly, while privately, enjoying the security and options that came with substantial wealth. I drove my reliable 2018 Honda Civic while keeping my investment portfolio diversified across growth and income funds. I shopped at Target for everyday items while secretly browsing luxury travel websites. I let them think I was worried about money while actually meeting quarterly with my financial advisor to optimize my investment strategy. The financial advisor, Patricia Rodriguez, had become something of a mentor to me. She was about Linda's age, but she treated me with respect and admiration rather than condescension. "Eleanor," she'd said during our last meeting, "you have enough assets to live very comfortably for the rest of your life, even if you live to 100. You could travel extensively, upgrade your home, pursue hobbies, or help family members if you choose to. But it should be your choice, not an obligation. Your choice." When was the last time my children had talked about my life in terms of choices rather than limitations? 3 months ago, I had made another decision that my children knew nothing about. I had started seeing Dr. Patricia Williams, a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and what she called elder emotional abuse. During our first session, when I'd described my children's pattern of helping me adjust to widowhood, she'd stopped me mid-sentence. "Eleanor, what you're describing isn't helping. It's systematic emotional manipulation designed to keep you feeling helpless and grateful for their minimal attention." The words had hit me like a physical blow. Emotional abuse? My children weren't abusive. They were just concerned, protective, maybe a little impatient with my adjustment to life without Harold. But over the course of several sessions, Dr. Williams had helped me see patterns I'd been blind to for 3 years. Healthy adult children, she'd explained, support their widowed parent through grief and adjustment. They celebrate their parents' growing independence and new interests. They don't create artificial crises to prove their indispensability. She'd introduced me to concepts I'd never heard of: infantilization, financial manipulation, emotional gaslighting. She'd helped me understand that in dysfunctional family systems, elderly parents are often treated as children who can't be trusted to make their own decisions. "Eleanor," Dr. Williams had said during our session just 2 weeks ago, "what do you think would happen if you stopped seeking their approval for your decisions? What if you just lived your life according to your own priorities and interests?" "They'd be angry," I'd said immediately. "And then what?" They'd lecture me about being irresponsible, tell me I'm not thinking clearly." "And then what?" I'd sat there for a long moment, really thinking about it. "I guess nothing?" "They'd be upset, but my life would go on." "Exactly. Their approval or disapproval doesn't actually have any power over your life unless you give it that power." Sitting in first class, accepting my pre-flight champagne from the flight attendant, I realized that Dr. Williams had been preparing me for exactly this moment. She'd been helping me understand that I didn't need my children's permission to live my life, and I didn't need their approval to know my own worth. Another advantage my children had never suspected: I was actually incredibly good with technology and modern life management. While they saw me as someone who needed help with everything from smartphones to online banking, I'd been quietly becoming an expert at digital independence. After Harold died, I'd made a conscious decision to master every aspect of technology that I'd previously relied on him to handle. I'd taken classes at the senior center, watched YouTube tutorials, and practiced until I was completely comfortable with everything from video calling to online shopping. I could navigate social media better than Robert, who still thought Facebook was cutting edge. I could book travel, research restaurants, and read reviews on multiple platforms. I'd even learned to use investment apps to monitor my portfolio in real time. My TikTok account, which my granddaughter Melissa had helped me set up 6 months ago, now had over 15,000 followers who loved my cooking videos and stories about life as a widow. I'd been posting regularly about learning new recipes, trying new hobbies, and adjusting to life on my own. My children had no idea about my social media presence. They still thought I could barely operate a smartphone. I'd downloaded language learning apps and had been studying basic French for months. Not because I was planning a trip, but because I'd always regretted not continuing with French after college. I was already conversational enough to handle basic interactions like ordering food, asking for directions, and being polite in social situations. I'd researched Paris neighborhoods extensively, knew which areas were best for senior travelers, understood the metro system, and had bookmarked dozens of museums, restaurants, and cultural sites I wanted to visit. I'd even found English-speaking guided tours of the Louvre and Versailles that I'd been dreaming about experiencing. My phone was set up with international data, offline maps, translation apps, and all the travel apps I'd need. I'd researched tipping customs in France, cultural etiquette, and practical tips that would help me be a respectful visitor. The woman boarding this plane wasn't someone who needed constant supervision and guidance. She was someone who had been quietly preparing for adventure while everyone around her assumed she was incapable of handling her own life. One of the most insulting aspects of my children's treatment was their constant concern about my health and safety, as if being 70 automatically made me fragile and incapable. The truth was, I was in excellent health. My last physical, just 2 months ago, had been glowing. My doctor, Dr. Amanda Chen, had actually commented on how well I was doing. "Eleanor, your blood pressure is perfect, your cholesterol levels are excellent, and your bone density is better than most women your age. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." What I was doing was taking care of myself. I walked 3 miles every morning, did yoga twice a week at the senior center, ate a balanced diet rich in vegetables and lean proteins, and took only the minimal medications appropriate for my age, a low-dose aspirin and a multivitamin. I was more physically fit than Linda, who complained constantly about her back pain and took prescription medications for anxiety and high blood pressure. I had more energy than Robert, who was already developing the health problems that come from a sedentary lifestyle and poor diet. But somehow, their narrative about my supposed frailty had become accepted family truth. Every conversation included references to my age and limitations, as if being 70 meant I was already 1 foot in the grave. "Mom, you need to be realistic about what you can handle at your age," Linda would say when I mentioned wanting to try new activities or visit new places. "Mom, you're not as young as you used to be," Robert would add whenever I expressed interest in anything more adventurous than grocery shopping and doctor visits. The irony was that I felt better, stronger, and more energetic at 70 than I had in my 50s, when I was stressed about raising teenagers and caring for aging parents. Widowhood, once I'd worked through the grief, had actually been liberating in many ways. But my children preferred to see me as declining rather than thriving, dependent rather than independent, because it justified their need to control and manage my life. Perhaps the biggest secret I'd been keeping from my children was how rich and fulfilling my social life had become. While they constantly worried about me being isolated and lonely, I had actually built a vibrant community of friends and activities that kept me busy and engaged. The senior center had become my second home. I participated in book clubs, cooking classes, art workshops, and social groups that introduced me to dozens of interesting people my age who were living full, active lives. I'd joined a hiking group that explored local trails every weekend. I'd taken up pottery and had progressed enough to sell my pieces at the senior center's craft fairs. I'd started volunteering at the local literacy center, helping adults learn to read, something that gave me tremendous purpose and satisfaction. I'd also reconnected with old friends from high school and college through Facebook, and several of these renewed friendships had become important parts of my weekly routine. We met for lunch, attended cultural events together, and supported each other through the challenges and celebrations of our later years. My friend Dorothy, who had been widowed around the same time I was, had become a particularly close companion. We traveled together to nearby cities for museum visits and theater performances. We tried new restaurants, attended lectures at the local university, and had even taken a weekend trip to wine country that had been absolutely delightful. But when I'd mentioned these activities to my children, their responses were always focused on potential problems rather than celebration of my expanding social life. "Mom, you need to be careful about people who might take advantage of elderly widows," Linda had warned when I'd mentioned making new friends. "Mom, you shouldn't be driving to unfamiliar places with people we don't know," Robert had added when I'd told them about weekend trips with Dorothy. Their constant warnings and concerns had taught me to stop sharing details about my social life. It was easier to let them think I was lonely and isolated than to deal with their lectures about safety and their suspicious attitudes toward my new friendships. So they had no idea that I was actually having the most socially fulfilling period of my adult life. They thought I was sitting at home feeling sorry for myself when I was actually busier and happier than I'd been in decades. Another aspect of my secret life was the significant investment I'd been making in personal growth and new experiences. While my children saw me as someone who was stuck in the past and resistant to change, I had actually been pursuing learning opportunities with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt since my college years. I'd enrolled in continuing education classes at the local community college. Over the past 2 years, I'd taken courses in art history, creative writing, French conversation, and even basic computer programming. Not because I needed career skills, but because learning new things kept my mind sharp and gave me tremendous satisfaction. The art history class had been particularly transformative. Professor Martinez had opened my eyes to movements and artists I'd never studied before, and I'd developed a genuine passion for understanding visual culture. This was partly why Paris felt like such a perfect destination. I could finally see in person the paintings and sculptures I'd been studying in books and slides. I'd also been taking private French lessons with a retired teacher named Marie Dubois, a French expatriate who had moved to our area with her American husband. Our weekly sessions had progressed from basic vocabulary to sophisticated conversations about French culture, history, and literature. "Eleanor," Marie had said during our last lesson, "your French is excellent for a student your age. You would have no trouble navigating Paris or having meaningful conversations with French people. Your age." Even when it was meant as a compliment, the constant references to my age were exhausting. Why couldn't I just be a good French student? I'd been saving money specifically for a trip to France. Not because I was planning to go immediately, but because having that goal gave me motivation to continue studying and dreaming. I'd researched hotels, restaurants, and cultural activities for months, creating detailed itineraries for a hypothetical future trip. Sitting in first class, reviewing the Paris guidebook I'd purchased months ago, I realized that all of this preparation was about to pay off in ways I'd never expected. Perhaps the most surprising development in my post-Herald life was the emergence of creative interests I'd suppressed for decades. During my marriage and child-rearing years, I'd been so focused on practical responsibilities that I'd never had time to explore artistic pursuits. But in the past 2 years, I'd discovered that I had genuine talent and passion for several creative activities. The pottery classes had revealed an aptitude for working with clay that surprised even me. My pieces had evolved from simple bowls to complex sculptural forms that other students admired and asked to purchase. I'd also started writing, first just journal entries to process my grief, then short stories and even the beginning of a memoir about caring for Harold during his illness. My creative writing instructor, a published novelist named David Park, had been encouraging about my work. "Eleanor, you have a natural storytelling ability and a unique perspective on life experiences that many people don't get to write about until they're your age," he'd said after reading one of my pieces. "Have you considered submitting some of these stories for publication?" Publication. The idea that my writing might be worth sharing with a broader audience was both thrilling and terrifying. But it was another example of potential I was discovering in myself that my children had never recognized or encouraged. I'd even started painting, watercolors mostly, inspired by the art history classes and encouraged by the senior center's art instructor. My paintings weren't masterpieces, but they gave me tremendous joy and a sense of accomplishment that I hadn't experienced in years. These creative pursuits had become central to my identity and happiness, but my children dismissed them as nice hobbies that were keeping me busy. They didn't understand that I wasn't just killing time, I was discovering parts of myself that had been dormant for decades. As the flight attendant offered me a second glass of champagne, something I'd never experienced in economy class, I reflected on the sophisticated financial strategy I'd been implementing without my children's knowledge or input. Working with Patricia Rodriguez, my financial advisor, I'd diversified my portfolio in ways that would have surprised my children, who seemed to think that elderly widows should keep all their money in safe savings accounts earning minimal interest. We'd invested in a mix of growth stocks, dividend-paying securities, and international funds that were generating substantial returns. My portfolio had grown by over $150,000 in the past 18 months, even as I'd been drawing modest amounts for living expenses and my new activities. I'd also set up automatic transfers that moved money into different accounts for different purposes: travel, gifts for grandchildren, charitable giving, and emergency funds. This system ensured that I could pursue my interests without feeling guilty about spending money, because each expense category had been planned and budgeted. The first-class ticket to Paris, which cost $6,200, represented less than 1 month's investment returns. The 5-star hotel I'd booked at the George V, the luxury shopping I was planning, the fine dining experiences I wanted to try, all of it was easily affordable within my carefully planned budget. But my children had no idea about any of this financial sophistication. They still thought I needed help balancing my checkbook and worried that I might be taken advantage of by financial scammers. The truth was, I was probably more financially literate and better at investment strategy than either of them. Linda and Robert were both carrying substantial debt and living paycheck to paycheck despite their higher incomes, while I was building wealth and living comfortably off my returns. As we reached cruising altitude and I settled in for the long flight to Paris, I checked my phone and was amazed by what I found. My TikTok videos about being abandoned at the airport had exploded overnight. The most recent video had over 100,000 views and thousands of comments. People were not just sympathetic, they were outraged on my behalf and inspired by my response to the situation. Eleanor, you are an absolute queen. Your children have no idea what they've lost. I'm 45 and I don't have half the courage you're showing. You're inspiring me to stand up for myself. Your kids are going to regret this for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, you're about to have the adventure of a lifetime. As someone whose elderly parents were manipulated by their adult children, thank you for showing that seniors don't have to accept mistreatment. But the comments that meant the most to me were from other seniors who shared their own stories of family manipulation and found hope in my example. I'm 68, and my daughter treats me like I'm incompetent. Watching you take control of your life is giving me ideas. Eleanor, you're showing us that our age doesn't mean we have to accept being treated poorly. Brava! I've been letting my son control my finances and social life since my husband died. Your videos are making me realize I need to reclaim my independence. I started a new video, showing the first-class cabin around me. Hello from 35,000 feet, everyone! This is what a mental breakdown looks like when you're 70 years old. First-class service to Paris, champagne, and more legroom than I know what to do with. Thank you to everyone sharing their own stories in the comments. We're proving that age is just a number, and independence is a choice. As my Paris videos gained traction, extended family members started reaching out. Apparently, my social media presence was making it impossible for Linda and Robert to maintain their narrative about what had actually happened. My sister Margaret called while I was enjoying the multi-course dinner service. Eleanor, I've been watching your videos and I am absolutely livid with your children. They told everyone here that you were having emotional difficulties and couldn't handle the stress of travel. Meanwhile, you're obviously thriving and having the adventure of a lifetime. They actually said I was having emotional difficulties? Linda. Specifically said you'd been struggling with depression since Harold died, and that the family trip felt too overwhelming for someone in your emotional state. She even suggested that you might need professional help. The manipulation was breathtaking. They hadn't just abandoned me, they had created an entire false narrative to justify their cruelty while making themselves look like responsible, caring children dealing with a difficult elderly parent. Margaret, I want you to know that I've never been more mentally healthy or emotionally stable in my life. Being on my own in Paris has been incredible for my confidence and sense of adventure. I can see that, honey. You look happier and more alive in these videos than I've seen you since before Harold got sick. And frankly, after watching how you've handled this situation, I'm starting to wonder if your children have been lying to all of us about your capabilities for years. That evening, as the flight attendants dimmed the cabin lights and I settled into my fully reclining seat, I got a call from my great-niece, Sarah. "Great Aunt Eleanor, I've been following your Paris adventure on TikTok and I am living for it. Also, I owe you a huge apology." "For what, sweetheart?" "For believing Linda and Robert when they said you couldn't come because of health problems. I should have called you directly instead of just accepting their explanation. I've known you my whole life. You've never been frail or unable to handle travel. Sarah, you had no reason not to believe them. They're my children. Why would you assume they were lying about their own mother?" "Because now I'm realizing they've been misrepresenting you to the family for years." "Great Aunt Eleanor, Linda told everyone that you've been declining since Uncle Harold died and struggling to manage basic life tasks. But your videos show someone who's clearly competent, adventurous, and having the time of her life." "What else have they said about me?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, they've painted a picture of you as someone who's confused, dependent, and unable to handle adult responsibilities. They've made it seem like they're constantly having to supervise your decisions and protect you from making mistakes." "Sarah, I haven't asked Linda or Robert for help with anything in over a year. I've been completely independent since I finished grieving Harold." "I'm starting to realize that." "And Great Aunt Eleanor? Everyone at the wedding kept asking where you were because they wanted to see you and catch up, not because they were worried about your health. You've always been one of the most interesting, capable people in our family." As we began our descent into Charles de Gaulle Airport, I reflected on something that had surprised me about the response to my situation. Several people had reached out to offer me professional opportunities based on my TikTok videos. A literary agent named Susan Chen had sent me a direct message. "Eleanor, I've been following your story, and I'm fascinated by your perspective on family dynamics and aging. Have you ever considered writing a book about your experiences? Your voice is authentic, wise, and incredibly engaging. A book." The idea that my story might be worth sharing on that scale was both thrilling and intimidating. A travel blogger named Michael Torres had also reached out. "Eleanor, would you be interested in collaborating on content about solo travel for seniors? Your perspective is exactly what the travel industry needs to hear." Even my own financial advisor had called. "Eleanor, I've been showing your videos to other clients as an example of what financial independence can make possible at any age. Would you consider speaking to groups about financial planning for widows? These weren't pity offers or attempts to humor an elderly woman. These were legitimate professional opportunities based on recognition of my capabilities and unique perspective." My children had always treated my interests and activities as cute hobbies that weren't really important. But strangers who had seen my videos understood that I had valuable knowledge, experience, and insights to share. For the first time in years, I felt valued for who I was, rather than tolerated, despite who I was. As the plane touched down in Paris at 6:45 a.m. local time, I felt a surge of excitement that I hadn't experienced since I was a young woman. I was about to experience one of the world's great cities completely on my own terms, with no one to please but myself. I had 5 days in Paris planned, with hotel reservations at the George V, dinner reservations at Michelin-starred restaurants, tickets to the Louvre and Musée d'Orsay, and a private guide for a day trip to Versailles. But more than the specific activities, I was excited about the freedom to discover what I enjoyed when I wasn't constantly being told what I should prefer or what was appropriate for someone my age. I wanted to sit in sidewalk cafes and watch Parisian life unfold around me. I wanted to practice my French with native speakers who would judge me on my effort rather than my age. I wanted to buy myself beautiful things without anyone commenting on whether I needed them or whether I should be saving money for practical purposes. I wanted to prove to myself that I could navigate international travel, handle unexpected challenges, and create my own adventure without anyone else's input or approval. My phone buzzed with one final message from Linda. "Mom, we heard you went to Paris instead of coming home. This is exactly the kind of impulsive, irresponsible behavior we were trying to help you avoid. When you get back, we need to have a serious conversation about your decision-making." I typed back, "Linda, I'm having the most wonderful time. Paris is everything I dreamed it would be. I'm learning so much about independence and what it feels like to be treated with respect instead of constant criticism. Thank you for this incredible gift." Then I turned off my phone and walked into my new life. The adventure was just beginning, and for the first time in 3 years, I couldn't wait to see what happened next. My children had wanted to teach me that I couldn't survive without them. Instead, they were about to learn through my Paris videos that I couldn't just survive without them. I could absolutely flourish. The student had become the teacher, and the lesson they were about to receive would be far more expensive than anything they had ever tried to teach me. At 70 years old, I was finally free to discover who I really was when nobody was telling me who I should be. And that discovery was going to be magnificent. To understand how my adult children could abandon their 70-year-old mother at an airport and call it a life lesson, you need to understand the family dynamic that had been building since Harold's death 3 years ago. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was the culmination of a systematic campaign to convince me that I was incompetent, dependent, and grateful for whatever attention they chose to give me. The transformation in how my children treated me didn't happen overnight. It began subtly, in the months after Harold's funeral, when I was most vulnerable and least likely to recognize manipulation for what it was. Harold and I had been married for 47 years. We'd built a life together that was comfortable, predictable, and deeply satisfying. He handled the finances and major decisions. I managed the household and social obligations, and we complemented each other in ways that made both of us stronger. When he died after an 18-month battle with pancreatic cancer, I felt like half of myself had been ripped away. During those first months of widowhood, I was genuinely struggling. I was learning to manage finances I'd never had to think about, making decisions Harold and I had always made together, and trying to figure out who I was as an individual rather than as half of a married couple. I needed support, guidance, and patience while I found my footing. What I got instead was a systematic campaign to convince me that I would never be capable of managing my own life. Linda, my 45-year-old daughter, had always been the more assertive of my 2 children. Even as a teenager, she'd had strong opinions about how other people should live their lives, and she'd never hesitated to share those opinions whether they were wanted or not. As an adult, she'd become a high school principal, a role that seemed to reinforce her natural tendency to treat everyone around her like children who needed constant correction and supervision. Robert, my 43-year-old son, had always been more laid back, but he'd married Carol, a woman who shared Linda's belief that they knew better than everyone else how life should be lived. Carol was a nurse practitioner who specialized in geriatric care, which meant she had just enough medical knowledge to sound authoritative when making pronouncements about what was appropriate for someone my age. In the months after Harold's death, these personality traits had crystallized into a coordinated effort to position themselves as the responsible adults who needed to manage their incompetent elderly mother. The first indication that something was wrong came during the funeral planning process. Harold had made his wishes clear. He wanted a simple service, cremation, and a small gathering of close family and friends. But when I tried to honor those wishes, my children intervened with what they called realistic adjustments for your emotional state. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly right now," Linda had said when I insisted on planning the service myself. "Let us handle the details so you can focus on grieving." "Mom, you don't understand how much work goes into organizing something like this," Robert had added. "You're already overwhelmed, and trying to manage all these decisions will just make things worse." When I protested that I was perfectly capable of planning my own husband's funeral, they exchanged those looks, the ones that said they were dealing with a difficult elderly person who didn't understand her own limitations. "Of course you're capable, Mom," Carol had said in the patronizing tone she probably used with confused patience. But there's no reason to put that stress on yourself when you have children who want to help. Help! That word would become a weapon they used against me for the next 3 years. They took over the funeral arrangements completely, making decisions I disagreed with and dismissing my objections as emotional reactions that weren't practical or reasonable. They invited people Harold wouldn't have wanted there, chose flowers he would have hated, and planned a reception that was more about their social connections than about honoring his memory. When I tried to assert my preferences, I was told I was being difficult and not thinking about what's best for the family. When I pointed out that Harold had specifically said he didn't want a big production, they said I was clinging to details instead of focusing on the bigger picture. The funeral ended up being exactly what they wanted and nothing like what Harold or I would have chosen. But worse than the specific decisions was the precedent they'd established. I was no longer considered competent to make important decisions about my own life. 2 weeks after the funeral, Linda and Robert asked to meet with me about getting your finances organized. They arrived at my house with folders, legal pads, and the unmistakable air of adults who were about to solve a problem that was too complicated for me to understand. Mom, we know Dad handled all the money stuff, and we want to make sure you're set up for success, Linda began. We've been talking, and we think the best approach would be to simplify everything so you don't have to worry about complicated financial decisions. What do you mean by simplify? I asked. Robert pulled out a printed sheet of paper. We researched the best options for widows in your situation, and we think you should consolidate everything into a simple checking account and a basic savings account. That way, you won't have to keep track of multiple investments or worry about market fluctuations. I stared at them. Harold and I had a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and retirement accounts that had taken us decades to build. They were suggesting I liquidate everything and put it in accounts that would earn essentially no interest. Also, Carol added, we think it would be smart to set up online access for Linda and Robert so they can help you monitor your accounts and make sure everything is running smoothly. Help me monitor my accounts. They wanted access to my money. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I think I'd like to meet with a financial advisor before making any major changes. The response was immediate and coordinated, as if they'd rehearsed it. Mom, financial advisors are just salespeople who want to make commissions off your money, Linda said. They'll try to convince you to buy expensive products you don't need. Mom, you're vulnerable right now, Robert added. There are a lot of people who target elderly widows and try to take advantage of them. We just want to protect you from making decisions you might regret later. Elderly widows. Vulnerable. Target. The language they used made it clear how they saw me, not as their capable mother who had helped raise them and manage a household for decades, but as a potential victim who needed their protection. When I insisted that I wanted to handle my own finances, at least until I'd had time to research my options, they reluctantly backed down. But I could see the frustration in their eyes, and I heard Linda whisper to Robert as they left. She's going to make this so much harder than it needs to be. Over the next few months, my children began a subtle but systematic campaign to isolate me from friends and activities while positioning themselves as my primary social connection. It started with comments about my driving. I'd been driving safely for over 50 years. But suddenly, every trip I took became an opportunity for them to express concern about my safety. Mom, are you sure you should be driving to the grocery store after dark? Linda would ask. The roads can be confusing at night, and your night vision isn't what it used to be. Mom, maybe you should limit your driving to familiar routes, Robert would suggest. It's easy to get lost when you're distracted by grief. When I pointed out that I'd never had any driving problems and felt completely comfortable behind the wheel, they would frame their concerns as coming from a place of love. We just worry about you, Mom. If something happened to you, we'd never forgive ourselves. The driving concerns escalated to suggestions that I should ask for rides instead of driving myself places. "Mom, why don't you call us when you need to go somewhere? We're happy to take you, and that way we know you got there safely." But when I did call for rides, they were often unavailable, too busy, or able to take me at times that didn't work with my schedule. The message was clear. I should limit my activities to what was convenient for them. They also began expressing skepticism about my friendships and social activities. When I mentioned having lunch with my friend Dorothy, Linda would ask probing questions. "What do you really know about this woman? Are you sure she doesn't have ulterior motives for befriending a widow?" When I talked about activities at the senior center, Robert would suggest that I was wearing myself out and should take things slower. When I mentioned new people I'd met or places I'd gone, Carol would warn me about people who prey on seniors and suggest I should be more cautious about trusting strangers. Over time, it became easier to stop mentioning my social activities than to deal with their constant warnings and concerns. They interpreted my silence as evidence that I was, indeed, becoming isolated and dependent on them for social interaction. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of their campaign was the way they weaponized concern about my health and safety. Every minor ache, pain, or moment of forgetfulness became evidence that I was declining and needed closer supervision. When I mentioned having a headache one afternoon, Linda immediately suggested I should see a doctor to rule out anything serious. When I said I'd probably just been reading too long and needed to take a break, she insisted that headaches in people my age could be signs of stroke, high blood pressure, or worse. When I couldn't immediately remember the name of a restaurant where Harold and I had eaten the previous year, Robert suggested I should consider having my memory tested. "Mom, memory problems can be early signs of dementia. It's better to catch these things early." When I slipped on a wet floor at the grocery store but caught myself without falling, Carol launched into a lecture about fall risks for seniors and suggested I should consider using a walker just to be safe. Every normal part of aging, occasional forgetfulness, minor aches and pains, moments of clumsiness, was treated as evidence of serious decline that required their intervention and oversight. But when I had my annual physical and my doctor pronounced me in excellent health for my age, my children dismissed the positive news with comments like, "Doctors don't always catch everything," and "You should probably get a second opinion." They wanted me to be declining, because my decline justified their increasing control over my life. By the first anniversary of Harold's death, my children had successfully positioned themselves as the final arbiters of what was appropriate, safe, and reasonable for me to do. Every decision I wanted to make was subject to their approval, and every choice they disagreed with was evidence of my poor judgment. When I mentioned wanting to redecorate the living room, something that would have helped me create a space that felt like mine rather than a shrine to my married life, Linda immediately had objections. "Mom, you shouldn't make major decisions like that while you're still grieving. You might choose things you'll regret later." When I said I'd been thinking about getting a small dog for companionship, Robert launched into a lecture about the responsibilities of pet ownership. "Mom, pets require a lot of care and attention. What if you get sick and can't take care of it? What if it trips you and you fall? What if it damages the house?" When I mentioned casually that I might like to take a cruise or travel somewhere Harold and I had never been together, Carol immediately began listing all the ways travel could be dangerous for someone my age. Foreign medical care, unfamiliar foods, time zone changes, walking on uneven surfaces. There are so many things that could go wrong. Every interest I expressed, every plan I considered, every desire I mentioned was met with a litany of potential problems and reasons why I should reconsider. Over time, I stopped sharing my thoughts and dreams with them because I was tired of being made to feel foolish for wanting anything beyond the most basic, cautious existence. One of the most painful aspects of their manipulation was the way they used my grandchildren, Linda's son Jake, now 16, and Robert's daughter Emma, now 14, to reinforce their narrative about my incompetence. Linda had begun limiting my time with Jake, claiming that I tired him out with my expectations and that spending time with me was stressful for him because I was too emotional about missing his grandfather. "Mom, Jake needs to be around positive influences right now," she'd said when I asked why he hadn't visited in months. "Your grief is really hard on him, and we think it's better if he sees you when you're in a better emotional place." Robert had taken a different approach with Emma, allowing visits but using them as opportunities to demonstrate my supposed incompetence. When Emma would visit, he'd call every hour to check in and make sure I was handling everything okay. "Is Grandma remembering to give you lunch? Is she keeping track of time? Are you feeling safe there?" The calls weren't subtle. Emma could hear every word, and the message was clear. Grandma couldn't be trusted to babysit safely. Over time, my grandchildren began treating me with the same cautious concern their parents modeled. Instead of the easy, loving relationships we'd always had, our interactions became stilted and careful, as if they were visiting a fragile elderly person who might break at any moment. To reinforce their narrative that I couldn't handle life on my own, my children began creating artificial emergencies that required their intervention. Linda would call in a panic about a weather forecast, insisting that I shouldn't drive anywhere because ice storms are especially dangerous for older drivers. When I pointed out that the roads were clear and the temperature was above freezing, she'd accuse me of not taking safety seriously. Robert would show up unannounced to check on me after hearing news reports about scams targeting seniors, burglaries in nearby neighborhoods, or health warnings that might affect people in your age group. These visits were always framed as concern for my welfare, but they served to reinforce the idea that I was constantly at risk and needed their protection. Carol would call with medical advice every time there was a news story about health issues affecting older adults. "Did you hear about the flu outbreak? You should probably avoid public places for a few weeks. Did you see the article about prescription drug interactions? You should bring all your medications to my office so I can review them." These manufactured crises created a constant state of anxiety and dependence. I began second-guessing my own judgment about simple decisions and deferring to their expertise about risks I'd been managing successfully for decades. Which brings us to how the Costa Rica trip became the perfect opportunity for my children to execute their most elaborate teaching moment yet. My great-niece Sarah's wedding had been planned for over a year. As one of her favorite relatives and someone who had been involved in her life since she was born, I had been invited to participate in the wedding celebration in Costa Rica. Sarah had specifically asked me to be part of the wedding party as an honored family member, and I had been thrilled to accept. For months, I had been looking forward to the trip. It represented everything I'd been wanting to do since Harold's death: travel to a beautiful destination, celebrate family happiness, and prove to myself that I could handle international travel independently. But as the trip approached, my children began expressing increasing concern about my ability to manage the logistics and challenges of foreign travel. "Mom, are you sure you've thought this through?" Linda had asked when I showed her my confirmed flight and hotel reservations. "International travel is really complicated, especially for someone who's never done it alone." "Mom, what if you get sick while you're there?" Robert had added. "Foreign medical care can be really expensive, and your insurance might not cover everything. What if you can't understand the language or get lost?" Carol had contributed. "Costa Rica isn't like traveling in the United States. There are different customs, different food, different everything." When I pointed out that Sarah had provided detailed information about the resort, that I'd purchased travel insurance, and that Costa Rica was a popular destination for American tourists with excellent infrastructure, they continued to find new reasons for concern. "What about your medications? What if you forget to take them or lose them? What about the time change? That can be really disorienting for older travelers. What about the flights? What if there are delays or cancellations and you're stranded somewhere?" Every practical concern I addressed was replaced by two new ones. It became clear that no amount of preparation or planning would satisfy their objections, because their real concern wasn't about logistics. It was about controlling my independence. As the departure date approached, they began suggesting compromises that would have effectively given them control over my trip. Maybe we should book you on the same flights we're taking, so we can help you if anything goes wrong. Maybe you should stay at the same hotel we're staying at, so we can keep an eye on you. Maybe we should handle all your transportation arrangements, so you don't have to worry about navigating on your own. Each suggestion was framed as helpfulness, but the effect would have been to turn my independent adventure into a supervised group activity where I was the problem to be managed. When I declined their help and insisted on maintaining my own arrangements, they became increasingly frustrated. I could see them exchanging looks and having whispered conversations, but I assumed they were just worried about me and would relax once they saw that I could handle the trip successfully. I had no idea they were planning to ensure that I never got the chance to prove my competence. The final clue that something was seriously wrong came the night before our scheduled departure. I had driven over to Linda's house to finalize last-minute coordination and make sure we were all clear on timing and logistics for the next day. When I arrived, I found Linda, Robert, and Carol sitting around the kitchen table with travel documents spread out in front of them. The conversation stopped abruptly when I walked in, and Carol actually gathered some papers together and put them in a folder. "Hi, everyone. I just wanted to confirm our timing for tomorrow. I have a 6:30 a.m. flight, and I think yours is at 3:30? The exchange of glances between my children was subtle but unmistakable. Linda cleared her throat. "Actually, Mom, we need to talk to you about the arrangements." Something cold settled in my stomach. "What about the arrangements?" "We've been discussing the situation and we're concerned that you might be taking on more than you can handle with this trip," Robert said. "What do you mean?" "Mom, international travel is really stressful, especially for someone traveling alone," Carol added. "We've been watching you prepare for this trip, and we can see how anxious and overwhelmed you're getting." I stared at them. I hadn't been anxious or overwhelmed. I'd been excited and thoroughly prepared. "I'm not anxious or overwhelmed. I'm looking forward to the trip." "Mom, you've been obsessing over details for weeks," Linda said. "The constant planning, the lists, the questions about every little thing. It's clear that you're feeling in over your head." "I've been planning carefully because I want the trip to go smoothly. That's not obsessing. That's being responsible." "But that's exactly what we're worried about," Robert said. "You're putting so much pressure on yourself to get everything perfect that you're setting yourself up for disappointment and stress." "What are you suggesting?" Linda and Robert exchanged another look. "We think it would be better if you stayed home this time," Linda said. "Maybe plan a smaller, local trip first to build up your confidence with travel." "Stay home? From Sarah's wedding? Absolutely not." "Mom, think about it rationally," Carol said in her most patronizing tone. "What if something goes wrong? What if you get confused about the flight connections or can't find your hotel? What if you get sick or have a medical emergency in a foreign country? Those are possibilities that any traveler faces. I've prepared for all of those contingencies." "But you don't have experience handling those kinds of problems on your own," Robert said. "Mom, we love you, and we don't want to see you struggle with something that might be too much for you right now." Too much for me. There it was. The fundamental assumption that I was incompetent to manage my own life. "I'm going to Sarah's wedding," I said firmly. "I've been planning this for months. I've paid for my flights and hotel, and Sarah is expecting me." "Actually," Linda said quietly, "we already talked to Sarah. We explained that you were having second thoughts about the travel, and she completely understood. She said the most important thing is that you feel comfortable and safe." My heart stopped. They had already contacted Sarah behind my back and created a narrative about my supposed reluctance to travel. You had no right to do that. Mom, we're your children, Robert said. We have every right to be concerned about your well-being and to take action when we think you're making decisions that could hurt you. This conversation is over, I said, standing up. I'm going to Costa Rica tomorrow as planned. But as I drove home that night, I had a sick feeling that they weren't going to let this go. I should have realized that people who had spent 3 years systematically undermining my confidence and independence wouldn't hesitate to sabotage the very trip that would prove them wrong. I should have booked my own transportation to the airport. I should have double-checked my flight details with the airline directly. I should have realized that people who saw me as incompetent would be willing to create the very incompetence they claimed to be protecting me from. But I didn't, because despite all the evidence to the contrary, I still believed that my children loved me and wanted what was best for me. I still believed that family meant people who supported each other's dreams rather than sabotaging them. The next morning, when that Uber arrived at 5:30 a.m. to take me to an airport where I would discover that my family had already abandoned me, everything about our relationship dynamic would finally become crystal clear. They had spent 3 years positioning themselves as the wise adults who needed to protect their incompetent elderly mother. But they were about to learn that the mother they had underestimated was far more capable than they had ever imagined, and far less willing to accept their definition of what her life should look like. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson they were about to receive would be far more expensive and far more public than anything they had ever tried to teach me. Stepping off the plane at Charles de Gaulle Airport felt like stepping into a dream I'd been nurturing for 50 years. The excitement coursing through my veins had nothing to do with the champagne from first class and everything to do with the realization that I was actually here, in Paris, France, completely on my own, about to prove to myself and the world that a 70-year-old widow could handle anything life threw at her. The immigration process was surprisingly straightforward. Despite my children's dire warnings about language barriers and cultural confusion, the French immigration officer smiled warmly when I presented my passport and said bonjour in my carefully practiced accent. Première visite à Paris? Asked with a kind expression. Oui, première visite. Je suis très excitée, I replied, proud that my months of French lessons with Marie Dubois were paying off immediately. Excellent. Bienvenue à Paris, madame. J'espère que vous passerez un merveilleux séjour. As I walked through the customs area with my single suitcase, packed efficiently with everything I needed for 5 days of Parisian adventure, I felt a surge of confidence that surprised me. Every interaction, every successful navigation of airport procedures, every moment of feeling competent and capable was like a small victory against the voices in my head that had been telling me I was too old, too fragile, too inexperienced to handle international travel. The RER train from the airport to central Paris was clean, efficient, and exactly as I'd researched. I'd memorized the route. RER-B to Châtelet-Les Halles, then Line 1 to George V Station, then a short walk to my hotel. As the train glided through the Parisian suburbs, and I watched the landscape change from industrial to residential to the elegant buildings of the city center, I felt like I was traveling through a living postcard. Other passengers on the train included business travelers reading newspapers in French, tourists studying guidebooks in various languages, and Parisians going about their daily lives with that particular air of sophisticated nonchalance I'd read about in travel books. No one stared at me or seemed concerned about an elderly American woman traveling alone. No one questioned my presence or suggested I might be out of my depth. I was just another passenger, another traveler, another person choosing to explore the world on her own terms. The Hotel George V exceeded even my highest expectations. As my taxi pulled up to the elegant Art Deco facade, I felt a moment of pure gratitude for the financial independence that made this experience possible. The doorman, resplendent in his uniform, opened my door with a warm smile and a greeting in English. Welcome to the Georges V, madame. May I assist you with your luggage? Merci beaucoup, I replied, attempting to use French whenever possible. C'est mon premier voyage à Paris. Magnifique! You will love our beautiful city. And your French? Is very good. The lobby was breathtaking. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and flower arrangements that were works of art in themselves. But what impressed me most was how the staff treated me, with genuine warmth and respect, not the patronizing concern I'd grown accustomed to from my children. Bonjour, Madame Thompson, the front desk clerk said as I approached. We are delighted to welcome you to Paris. I see this is your first visit. How exciting. We have prepared a lovely room for you on the 7th floor with a view of the courtyard. Would you like me to arrange any restaurant reservations or provide recommendations for your stay? Restaurant reservations. Cultural recommendations. The assumption that I was capable of making plans and enjoying sophisticated experiences. When was the last time someone had offered to help me access more pleasure rather than warning me about potential problems? I would love some recommendations, I said. I'm particularly interested in art museums and traditional French cuisine. Excellent choices. For museums, I recommend starting with the Louvre. It's only a short walk from here. For dining, I suggest Le Bristol for a classical French experience, or perhaps something more intimate like L'Ambroisie if you enjoy Michelin-starred cuisine. Michelin-starred cuisine. The clerk was recommending some of the finest restaurants in the world to me, a 70-year-old widow from Denver, without questioning whether I could afford it, understand the menu, or handle the sophistication of the experience. My room was elegant beyond anything I'd ever experienced. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a beautiful courtyard garden. The marble bathroom was larger than my kitchen at home, and the bed was draped in linens so fine they felt like silk against my skin. Fresh flowers adorned the writing desk, and a bottle of champagne sat chilling in an ice bucket with a note. Welcome to Paris, Madame Thompson. We hope your stay with us is magnifique. I took a photograph of myself in the beautiful room and immediately posted it to TikTok. Greetings. From the Georges V in Paris. This is what a mental breakdown looks like when you're 70 years old. Marble bathrooms, champagne, and the most beautiful view in the world. Thank you to my children for forcing me to discover what I'm capable of when I stop letting other people define my limitations. The comments began pouring in immediately. Eleanor, you are living your best life. Your children are probably kicking themselves right now. I'm 65 and you're inspiring me to book my own solo adventure. If you can do Paris at 70, I can certainly handle a weekend in New York. Your confidence is contagious. You're proving that age is truly just a number. I showed your videos to my elderly mother, who's been letting my siblings control her life. She's now planning her own independence trip. But the comment that meant the most came from a fellow senior. Eleanor, I'm 73 and my family treats me like I'm incompetent too. Watching you take back your power is giving me the courage to do the same. Thank you for showing us what's possible. After settling into my room and freshening up from the flight, I decided to begin my Parisian adventure immediately. My children had always insisted that I should take things slowly and not overdo it when traveling, but I felt energized rather than tired, excited rather than overwhelmed. My first destination was just a 10-minute walk from the hotel, the Champs-Élysées. As I stepped out of the Georges V and onto one of the most famous streets in the world, I felt a thrill that had nothing to do with touristy excitement and everything to do with personal triumph. I was walking down the Champs-Élysées in Paris. France, having booked the trip myself, navigated international travel independently and arrived safely at one of the world's finest hotels. Every step was proof that my children's assessment of my capabilities had been not just wrong, but absurdly, embarrassingly wrong. The street was everything I'd imagined and more. Elegant boutiques, sidewalk cafes, tree-lined walkways filled with people from all over the world. I stopped at a cafe called Fouquet's, ordered a café au lait in my carefully practiced French, and sat at an outdoor table watching Parisian life unfold around me. The waiter, a gentleman probably in his 50s, was patient with my French and complimented my pronunciation. "Your accent is quite good, madame. Are you studying French?" "Oui. I've been taking lessons for the past year. I've always dreamed of visiting Paris. And what do you think so far?" "C'est magnifique. Everything is even more beautiful than I imagined." "Ah, but you have only just arrived. Wait until you see our museums, our gardens, our architecture." Paris reveals herself slowly to those who take the time to truly see. As I sipped my coffee and watched the elegant Parisians hurrying past with their shopping bags and purposeful strides, I realized something profound. No one here saw me as an elderly widow who needed protection and supervision. To the Parisians around me, I was simply another visitor exploring their beautiful city, someone worthy of the same courtesy and respect they would show to any traveler. The difference in how I was being treated was startling. At home, every interaction with my children involved subtle reminders of my supposed limitations. Here in Paris, every interaction involved assumptions about my competence and independence. That afternoon, I walked to the Louvre Museum, the world's largest and most visited art museum. As I approached the iconic glass pyramid entrance, I felt a combination of excitement and nervousness that reminded me of my first day of college 50 years ago. The thrill of approaching something magnificent, combined with the slight anxiety of wondering if I belonged there. The museum was overwhelming in the best possible way. Room after room of artistic treasures that I'd studied in my art history classes, seen in books and documentaries, but never experienced in person. Standing before the Mona Lisa, seeing the actual brushstrokes of Leonardo da Vinci, feeling the weight of centuries of human creativity surrounding me, it was almost spiritual. But what moved me most wasn't just the art itself. It was the realization that I was experiencing it exactly as I wanted to, at my own pace, following my own interests, without anyone telling me to hurry up or slow down or focus on what they thought was most important. I spent 3 hours in the museum, completely absorbed in the paintings, sculptures, and historical artifacts. When I finally emerged back into the Parisian sunlight, I felt intellectually stimulated and culturally enriched in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I posted another TikTok video from the museum courtyard. Just spent 3 hours in the Louvre, and I could have stayed all day. Funny how my children always worried that travel would be too much for me. But the hardest part was deciding which masterpieces to focus on first. Turns out, 70-year-old brains are perfectly capable of appreciating world-class art. Who knew? The response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Eleanor, you are glowing. The joy on your face is infectious." I've been to the Louvre 3 times and never spent more than an hour there. Your appreciation is inspiring me to slow down and really see art. Your children probably think the Louvre is too complicated for seniors. Meanwhile, you're having the cultural experience of a lifetime. That evening, I decided to test another assumption my family had made about my capabilities, that I couldn't handle sophisticated dining experiences on my own. I'd made a reservation at Le Bristol, one of the restaurants the hotel had recommended, despite Carol's warnings that foreign food might be too rich or complicated for someone my age. Le Bristol was elegant beyond my wildest dreams: crystal, chandeliers, pristine white tablecloths, and service so attentive it felt like choreography. When I arrived for my 7:30 reservation, the maitre d' greeted me warmly and escorted me to a beautiful table by the window. "Bonsoir, Madame Thompson. We are delighted to welcome you this evening. Is this a special occasion?" "Actually, yes," I said with a smile. "It's my first evening in Paris, and I'm celebrating my independence." "Magnifique. Then we must make this evening memorable. May I suggest our tasting menu with wine pairings? Our sommelier has selected exceptional wines that complement each course perfectly. A tasting menu with wine pairings. 6 months ago, my children would have been horrified at the idea of me dining alone at a fine restaurant, much less ordering multiple courses with alcohol. They would have worried about my safety, my judgment, my ability to handle the sophisticated atmosphere. But sitting in that beautiful restaurant, being treated with respect and warmth by the professional staff, I realized that their concerns said far more about their perception of me than about my actual capabilities. The meal was extraordinary. Each course was a work of art, beautifully presented and perfectly prepared. The sommelier took time to explain each wine pairing, teaching me about French wine regions and grape varieties with the kind of respect typically reserved for serious wine enthusiasts. Madame has an excellent palate, he said after I correctly identified subtle flavors in a Burgundy he'd selected. You appreciate the complexity of the terroir. Terroir. He was using sophisticated wine terminology with me, assuming I could understand and appreciate nuanced concepts about viticulture. When was the last time anyone in my family had credited me with having refined tastes or intellectual sophistication? During the meal, I struck up a conversation with the couple at the next table, a retired professor from London and his wife who were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. They were delighted to learn about my solo adventure and impressed by my courage in traveling to Paris independently. Good for you, the wife said enthusiastically. I've always wanted to travel on my own, but I've never had the nerve. You're inspiring me to plan my own solo adventure. At our age, we have the luxury of doing exactly what we want, her husband added. No need to compromise or worry about what other people think. You're living proof that the best adventures might be still ahead of us. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore Montmartre, the historic artists' quarter that had been home to Picasso, Renoir, and Toulouse-Lautrec. The climb to the top of the hill was steep, but I took my time and enjoyed every step, stopping frequently to admire the view and catch my breath. At the summit, the Basilica of Sacré-Cœur was breathtaking, its white stone facade gleaming in the morning sun, the view over Paris stretching endlessly in every direction. I sat on the steps for nearly an hour, watching street artists create portraits and caricatures, listening to musicians play classical pieces on violin and accordion, and feeling completely at peace with my place in the world. A young street artist approached me and offered to draw my portrait. Madame, you have such a beautiful, serene expression. May I capture your happiness? My happiness. He saw happiness in my face, not the worry or confusion my children always seem to detect. The portrait he created was lovely. It showed a woman who looked confident, content, and engaged with the world around her. When he presented it to me, he said, "You have the look of someone who is exactly where she belongs." Exactly where she belongs. I bought the portrait and immediately posted a photo of it to TikTok. A Parisian street artist captured something my family never sees: happiness, confidence, and a woman who knows exactly where she belongs. Turns out that place is wherever I choose to be at any age. The comments were overwhelmingly positive. Eleanor, you look absolutely radiant. Paris agrees with you. That artist captured your inner strength perfectly. You're glowing with confidence. I'm showing this to my mom, who thinks she's too old to travel. You're proving that adventure has no expiration date. Later that afternoon, I visited the Musée d'Orsay, which houses the world's largest collection of Impressionist masterpieces. Standing before original works by Monet, Renoir, and Van Gogh that I'd studied in my art history classes, I felt a deep sense of intellectual and cultural satisfaction. The museum offered audio guides in multiple languages, but I challenged myself to use the French version, testing my language skills while learning about the artists and their techniques. To my delight, I was able to understand most of the commentary. and the few words I didn't know I looked up in my phone's translation app. Each day in Paris built on the previous day's successes, creating a snowball effect of confidence and capability that contradicted everything my children had told me about my limitations. I navigated the metro system easily, using my phone's map app to plan routes and buying tickets from automated machines without any difficulty. I ordered meals in restaurants using my improving French, engaged in conversations with shop owners and fellow tourists, and handled all the practical aspects of international travel without a single crisis or emergency. When I got slightly lost, trying to find a small museum in the Marais district, I didn't panic or call for help. I asked for directions from a friendly shopkeeper, practiced my French conversation skills, and discovered a charming neighborhood cafe where I stopped for lunch. What could have been a stressful mistake became an enjoyable adventure that led to unexpected discoveries. When rain caught me without an umbrella during an afternoon walk, I didn't retreat to my hotel. I ducked into a beautiful covered market, bought fresh flowers and local cheese, and spent an hour chatting with vendors who were delighted to practice their English while I practiced my French. Every challenge became an opportunity to prove to myself that I was more adaptable, resourceful, and resilient than my family had ever given me credit for. I documented each small triumph on social media, not to boast, but to create a record of my growing confidence and to inspire other seniors who might be accepting unnecessary limitations on their lives. Day 3 in Paris. Successfully navigated the metro during rush hour, ordered dinner entirely in French, and discovered that 70-year-old reflexes are perfectly adequate for Parisian street crossing. Still waiting for the catastrophic failure my children predicted. Rainy afternoon update. Turns out getting caught in a Paris downpour isn't a crisis. It's an excuse to discover covered markets and practice French with cheese vendors. My poor judgment led to the best brie of my life. One of the most surprising aspects of solo travel was how much easier it was to connect with other people. Without family members to buffer interactions or provide built-in social activities, I found myself having conversations with fellow travelers, hotel staff, and locals that were deeper and more meaningful than most interactions I'd had at home in months. At a wine bar in the Saint-Germain district, I met Margaret, a retired teacher from Australia who was also traveling solo through Europe. We spent 3 hours comparing travel experiences, sharing stories about navigating retirement and widowhood, and planning future adventures. I thought I was the only 70-year-old brave enough to travel alone, Margaret said as we shared a bottle of excellent Sancerre. It's so refreshing to meet someone else who refuses to let age define what's possible. My children think I'm having a mental breakdown, I told her, laughing at how absurd their assessment seemed from this vantage point. They abandoned me at an airport to teach me a lesson about independence. And look how well their lesson worked. Margaret raised her glass in a toast. Here's to children who accidentally give their parents the greatest gifts of their lives. At the Musée Rodin, I struck up a conversation with Henri, a retired philosophy professor who offered to share his expertise about the sculptor's techniques and influences. We spent the afternoon discussing art, literature, and the relationship between creativity and aging. You know, Henri said as we admired the thinker in the museum's garden, some of the world's greatest artists did their most innovative work in their later years. Monet painted his water lilies in his 70s and 80s. Grandma Moses didn't start painting until she was 78. Age can be liberating for creativity because you stop caring about other people's expectations. Stop caring about other people's expectations. The phrase resonated deeply with me as I thought about how much energy I'd wasted trying to meet my children's narrow definitions of appropriate behavior for someone my age. By my 4th day in Paris, I had accomplished things that my children had insisted were impossible or inadvisable for someone in my situation. I had navigated international travel, managed foreign currency, communicated in a foreign language, explored cultural institutions, dined at sophisticated restaurants, and made new friends from multiple countries. More importantly, I had done all of this while feeling energized rather than exhausted, confident rather than confused, and excited about future possibilities rather than resigned to limitations. The woman enjoying a leisurely breakfast at a sidewalk cafe on the Ile Saint-Louis bore no resemblance to the helpless elderly widow my children had described. She was engaged, curious, culturally sophisticated, and completely comfortable managing her own life. I made a TikTok video that morning that captured my transformation. It's day 4 in Paris, and I've discovered something interesting. When you're not constantly being told what you can't do, you discover what you absolutely can do. I've navigated international travel, museums, restaurants, and public transportation without a single crisis. Turns out the only thing I needed to be independent was for people to stop insisting I wasn't capable of independence. The video received thousands of comments from people sharing their own stories of family members who underestimated their capabilities. Too. Grandmother is 85 and my aunt won't let her drive to the grocery store alone. I'm sending her your videos to show her what's possible. Eleanor, you're not just having an adventure. You're starting a revolution for seniors who refuse to accept artificial limitations. I work in elder care and I see this all the time. Families who create dependence by assuming incompetence. You're proving that assumption wrong in the most spectacular way. The response to my Paris adventure had caught the attention of people beyond my family and friends. A travel blogger named Patricia Williams had reached out about featuring my story in an article about solo travel for seniors. A literary agent named Michael Rodriguez had expressed interest in helping me develop my experiences into a book about aging, independence, and family dynamics. Most surprisingly, I'd been contacted by Sarah Chen, a documentary filmmaker who was interested in following my story as part of a larger project about seniors who were redefining what was possible in their later years. Eleanor, your story is inspiring, but it's also representative of a much larger phenomenon, Sarah had explained during our video call. There are thousands of older adults who are accepting unnecessary limitations because their families have convinced them they're not capable of independence. Your example could help change how we think about aging and autonomy. These professional opportunities weren't charity or attempts to humor an elderly woman. They were legitimate recognition of my unique perspective and valuable insights. People saw my story as important enough to amplify. My voice is worth hearing. My experience is worth documenting and sharing. For the first time in years, I felt valued for who I was becoming rather than pitied for who I supposedly used to be. As I prepared for my final day in Paris, I reflected on the profound emotional transformation I'd experienced in just 4 days. The woman who had been abandoned at the Denver airport had been someone who, despite her hidden strength and resources, still sought approval from people who were determined not to give it. The woman preparing to leave Paris was someone who had discovered that she didn't need anyone's approval to live fully, explore boldly, and embrace new experiences with enthusiasm and confidence. I had learned that the voice in my head, telling me I was too old, too fragile, too inexperienced, too risky, that voice wasn't mine. It was a chorus of other people's fears and limitations that I had internalized as truth. But sitting in my beautiful hotel room, surrounded by souvenirs from museums and markets, photographs of new friends and incredible experiences, and the growing confidence that came from 4 days of unqualified success, I realized that voice had been silenced by evidence. I wasn't too old. I was exactly the right age to appreciate beauty, culture, and adventure without the distractions of career stress or child-rearing responsibilities. I wasn't too fragile. I was strong enough to walk miles through city streets, climb Montmartre, and stay intellectually engaged for hours in museums. I wasn't too inexperienced. I was experienced enough to handle challenges with grace and turn obstacles into opportunities. I wasn't too risky. I was careful, prepared, and capable of making smart decisions about my safety and well-being. My children had wanted to teach me that I couldn't survive without them. Instead, they had given me the opportunity to discover that I couldn't just survive without them. I could flourish beyond anything I had previously imagined possible. Tomorrow I would fly home to Denver, but I would not be returning as the same woman who had been abandoned at the airport 5 days ago. I would be returning as someone who knew her own worth, understood her own capabilities, and refused to accept other people's definitions of what her life should look like. The adventure was ending, but the transformation was just beginning. And my children were about to discover that their cruel lesson had created a woman who would never again allow herself to be treated as anything less than the capable, independent, valuable person she had always been. The student had indeed become the teacher, and the lesson they were about to receive would reshape our family dynamics forever. Flying home from Paris in first class, an upgrade I'd purchased for myself as a celebration of my successful adventure, I felt like a completely different person than the woman who had been abandoned at this same airport just 5 days earlier. As the plane descended over the familiar Colorado landscape, I wasn't returning as the defeated elderly widow my children had expected. I was returning as a woman who had discovered her own power and refused to give it away ever again. My phone had been buzzing constantly during the flight with notifications from my viral TikTok videos. My Paris adventure had been viewed over 2 million times, with thousands of comments from people around the world who were inspired by my story. But more importantly, I'd received messages from dozens of seniors who said my videos had given them the courage to reclaim their own independence from controlling adult children. The transformation wasn't just personal. It was becoming a movement. As I walked through the Denver airport, pulling my suitcase with confidence and purpose, I passed the exact spot where I'd sat in despair 5 days earlier. The contrast was striking. That morning, I'd been a woman who still believed she needed her children's approval to live her life. Now, I was a woman who understood that the only approval that mattered was her own. My phone rang as I waited for my Uber. It was Linda, and I could hear the anxiety in her voice before she even spoke. "Mom, where are you? We've been trying to reach you for days. When we got back from Costa Rica yesterday and you weren't home, we were worried something had happened to you." The irony was breathtaking. They had abandoned me at an airport, then worried when I wasn't available for them to contact. "I'm at the Denver airport, Linda. I just returned from the most wonderful trip to Paris." "Paris?" "Mom, what are you talking about? You didn't go to Paris. You went home." "Actually, I went to Paris. I've been documenting the entire trip on social media. Perhaps you should check my TikTok account before making assumptions about what I did or didn't do." The silence on the other end was deafening. I could practically hear Linda frantically Googling my name. "Mom, we need to talk. Robert and I are coming over tonight." "I'm afraid tonight won't work for me, Linda. I have other plans. We can schedule something for later this week if you'd like to discuss how our relationship is going to change going forward." "What do you mean, how our relationship is going to change?" "I mean that I'm no longer available to be treated as an incompetent elderly woman who needs constant supervision and guidance. I'm also no longer interested in seeking approval for my life choices from people who have consistently underestimated my capabilities." I hung up and immediately posted a TikTok from the airport. Back home in Denver, same airport where my family abandoned me 5 days ago. The difference? That woman needed their approval to feel worthy. This woman knows her worth has nothing to do with other people's opinions. Paris taught me that independence isn't something you achieve, it's something you choose. Linda and Robert showed up at my house the next evening without calling first. Their usual strategy for catching me off guard and maintaining control of conversations. But the woman who answered the door wasn't someone who could be caught off guard anymore. "Hello, Linda." "Hello, Robert. I wasn't expecting you, but I suppose we might as well get this conversation over with." They walked into my living room with the same air of concerned authority they'd been using for 3 years, but I could see uncertainty in their eyes that hadn't been there before. My viral TikTok videos had made it impossible for them to maintain their narrative about my incompetence, and they were clearly struggling to adjust their approach. "Mom, we need to talk about your behavior this week, Linda began, using the same tone she probably used with misbehaving students. Taking off to Paris without telling anyone where you were going was irresponsible and dangerous. Irresponsible to whom? I'm 70 years old, financially independent, and mentally competent. I don't need permission from my adult children to travel. But what if something had happened to you? What if you'd gotten sick or lost or hurt? We wouldn't have known where you were. Robert leaned forward with what he probably thought was a reasonable expression. Mom, we're just concerned about your safety. Paris is a big city, and you don't have experience with international travel. I looked at my son, the same child I'd raised, fed, educated, and supported through every crisis of his life, and realized that he genuinely believed I was incapable of handling experiences he considered routine for himself. Robert, I successfully navigated international travel, managed foreign currency, communicated in French, explored museums, dined at fine restaurants, and made new friends from multiple countries. Which part of that suggests incompetence to you? Well, you got lucky this time, but… Lucky? I interrupted. Robert, do you think your father and I raised you by luck? Do you think I managed our household for 47 years by luck? Do you think I cared for him through terminal cancer by luck? Linda shifted uncomfortably. Mom, this isn't about the past. This is about you making impulsive decisions that could have serious consequences. Like the serious consequences of abandoning your mother at an airport? They exchanged glances, and I could see them realizing that their usual strategy of making me feel guilty for questioning their judgment wasn't going to work anymore. Mom, we were trying to help you learn. You were trying to humiliate me into submission. You wanted to prove that I couldn't survive without your guidance and supervision. Instead, you proved that I can not only survive without you, I can thrive. Carol, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke up in her most condescending tone. Eleanor, we understand you're angry about the airport situation, but you have to realize that your recent behavior is concerning from a medical perspective. Making impulsive decisions, spending large amounts of money, traveling to foreign countries alone, these can be signs of cognitive changes that you might not be aware of. The audacity was breathtaking. She was actually suggesting that competence and independence were symptoms of mental illness. Carol, I had a complete cognitive assessment 6 months ago. My doctor declared me mentally sharp and physically healthy. My financial advisor has confirmed that my Paris trip was well within my budget and didn't impact my long-term financial security. My travel insurance company processed my claims efficiently because I had no medical emergencies or travel problems. Which professional opinion would you like to override with your amateur diagnosis? What my children didn't realize was that while they were trying to gaslight me in my living room, my TikTok videos about family manipulation and senior independence had been seen by millions of people, including many who knew our family or had connections to our community. My phone started buzzing with calls and messages from people who had seen my videos and wanted to share their own experiences or offer support. The response was overwhelming, but it was also validating in ways my children had never been. Dr. Patricia Williams, my therapist, called to tell me that she was getting referrals from seniors who had seen my videos and wanted help dealing with controlling adult children. Eleanor, your courage to speak publicly about this issue is helping more people than you realize. You've given voice to experiences that many older adults have been suffering through in silence. My financial advisor called to congratulate me on my excellent decision-making and to let me know that she was using my story as an example in her workshops about financial independence for widows. Eleanor, you've demonstrated exactly the kind of confident financial management we try to teach. Your children have no basis for questioning your competence. Even my doctor's office called after seeing news coverage of my story. Dr. Chen wanted to confirm that I was in excellent health and to offer to provide documentation of my cognitive assessment to anyone who questioned my mental capacity. But perhaps the most meaningful call came from my great-niece Sarah, whose wedding I had missed because of my children's manipulation. Great-Aunt Eleanor, I've been following your Paris adventure online, and I am so proud of you. Also, I owe you a huge apology for believing Linda and Robert when they said you couldn't handle the travel. I should have called you directly. Sarah, sweetheart, you had no reason to doubt them. They're my children. Why would you assume they were lying about their own mother? Because I'm realizing they've been lying about you for years. Great-Aunt Eleanor, you were always one of the strongest, smartest women in our family. The person in those Paris videos is who you've always been. We just couldn't see it through all their manipulation. As news of my story spread through our extended family, the response was swift and decisive. Relatives who had been accepting Linda and Robert's narrative about my supposed decline began questioning everything they'd been told. My sister Margaret called from Florida, furious. "Eleanor, I've been watching your videos, and I am absolutely, livid. I can't believe I fell for their stories about you having problems. You look happier and more vibrant than I've seen you in years." My brother James drove up from Colorado Springs to see me in person. "Ellie, I owe you an apology. Linda and Robert had me convinced you were struggling with depression and couldn't handle basic decisions. But the woman I see in these videos is sharp, confident, and living her best life." Cousin after cousin called to express their outrage at how I'd been treated and their admiration for how I'd responded. The family narrative that Linda and Robert had carefully constructed was crumbling as people saw evidence of my actual capabilities versus their claims about my limitations. But the most satisfying call came from my late husband's brother, Uncle Frank, who had always been Harold's closest confidant. "Eleanor, Harold would be so proud of you. He always said you were the strongest person he knew, and he worried about how Linda and Robert treated you after he died. He saw what they were doing, but he was too sick to intervene. This, standing up for yourself, proving them wrong, showing the world who you really are, this is exactly what he would have wanted for you." The media attention around my story had opened doors I never could have imagined. The literary agent who had contacted me while I was in Paris called with concrete offers from 3 publishing houses interested in my memoir about family dynamics, aging, and reclaiming independence. "Eleanor, your story resonates with millions of people who are dealing with similar family situations. A book about your experience could help countless families navigate these dynamics more healthily." The documentary filmmaker Sarah Chen flew to Denver to meet with me about participating in her project. "Eleanor, your story is important not just because it's inspiring, but because it's representative of a much larger social issue. Elder abuse often comes from family members who convince themselves they're being helpful. I was also contacted by AARP about speaking at their national conference about financial independence for seniors, and by several universities about participating in research studies on family dynamics and aging. These weren't pity offers or attempts to humor an elderly woman. These were legitimate professional opportunities based on recognition of my unique perspective and valuable insights. When Linda and Robert continued to call and demand meetings to discuss my behavior, I realized I needed to establish clear boundaries about how our relationship would function going forward. I scheduled a meeting with both of them, but this time I controlled the terms. We met at a coffee shop of my choosing, at a time that worked for my schedule, with a clear agenda that I had prepared. I've asked you both here because I want to be completely clear about how our relationship is going to change, I began. For the past 3 years, you've treated me as an incompetent elderly woman who needed constant supervision and guidance. That ends today. Linda tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. You abandoned me at an airport to teach me a lesson about independence." Message received. "I am completely independent, financially secure, mentally competent, and physically capable. I don't need your permission, approval, or supervision for any aspect of my life." "Mom, we're your children," Robert protested. "We love you and want what's best for you." If you love me, you'll treat me with the respect and dignity I deserve. If you want what's best for me, you'll celebrate my independence instead of undermining it. I pulled out a piece of paper with my new terms written down. Going forward, here are the new rules for our relationship. First, I will not tolerate any comments about my age, capabilities, or limitations. Second, I will not discuss my financial decisions, travel plans, or life choices unless I specifically ask for your input. Third, you will not contact other family members to discuss your concerns about my behavior or competence. Fourth, you will not attempt to manage, supervise, or control any aspect of my life. Carol looked stunned. Eleanor, these demands seem unreasonable. These aren't demands, Carol. These are boundaries. The same boundaries any healthy adult relationship should have. If you can't respect them, then we won't have a relationship. In the weeks following my return from Paris, I embraced my newfound independence with enthusiasm that surprised even me. I enrolled in advanced French classes at the university, planning for my next international trip. I joined a hiking group for active seniors and discovered that I could easily keep up with people 20 years younger than me. I started writing my memoir, working with the literary agent to develop a proposal that would reach the widest possible audience. The working title was Abandoned at 70, How My Children's Cruelty Became My Greatest Gift. I also began volunteering with an organization that helped elderly people who were being financially or emotionally abused by family members. My story had inspired dozens of seniors to seek help in escaping controlling situations, and I found tremendous purpose in supporting their journeys to independence. Most surprisingly, I started dating. A gentleman named William, whom I'd met in my French class, asked me to dinner, and I accepted. When I mentioned this to Linda during one of our infrequent phone calls, her response was predictably negative. Mom, you need to be careful about men who might be interested in your money. Linda, William is a retired professor who has his own substantial pension and savings. But even if he were interested in my money, that would be my business, not yours. But, Mom, you don't have experience with dating at your age. There are scams targeting elderly widows. Linda, this conversation is over. My personal life is not subject to your approval or supervision. I hung up and immediately called William to confirm our dinner plans. At 70 years old, I was rediscovering the joy of romance, the pleasure of intellectual companionship, and the excitement of building new relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Perhaps the most rewarding aspect of my transformation was seeing how it inspired other people to reclaim their own power. From controlling family members, my TikTok account had grown to over 100,000 followers, mostly seniors who were learning to set boundaries with adult children who had convinced them they were incompetent. I received hundreds of messages from people sharing their own stories. Eleanor, I'm 68 and my daughter has been controlling my finances for 5 years. Your videos gave me the courage to hire my own financial advisor and take back control of my money. My son convinced me I was too old to live alone and moved me into assisted living against my wishes. After seeing your story, I moved out and got my own apartment. I'm thriving. I let my children sell my car because they said I was too old to drive safely. After watching your Paris videos, I bought a new car and planned a road trip. At 75, I'm more independent than ever. Dr. Williams told me that she was seeing a significant increase in elderly clients who were seeking help with family boundary issues. Eleanor, your willingness to speak publicly about this has opened the floodgates. So many seniors have been suffering in silence, accepting treatment they would never tolerate from strangers simply because it was coming from family. 6 months after my Paris trip, my memoir was published to critical acclaim and commercial success. Abandoned at 70, spent 12 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and was translated into 15 languages. The book tour was exhausting, but exhilarating. I traveled to dozens of cities, speaking to audiences of thousands about aging, independence, and the importance of refusing to accept other people's limitations on your life. At a book signing in Chicago, an elderly woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm 82 years old, and my family has had me convinced I was too old and frail to live independently. After reading your book, I've decided to move out of my daughter's house and get my own apartment. If you can navigate Paris at 70, I can certainly manage my own life at 82. These interactions reminded me daily that my personal transformation had become something much larger. A movement of seniors who were refusing to accept artificial limitations and demanding to be treated with dignity and respect. A year after the airport abandonment, Linda and Robert finally requested a meeting to discuss our relationship. They had watched my success, my happiness, and my growing influence with what I could only describe as bewilderment. "Mom, we've been watching everything you've accomplished this year," Linda began hesitantly. "The book, the speaking engagements, the media appearances, we're proud of you. But we're also confused," Robert added. "If you were capable of all this, why didn't you show us before? Why did you seem so helpless after Dad died?" I looked at my adult children, both successful in their own careers, both intelligent and educated, and realized they genuinely didn't understand how their treatment had created the very helplessness they claimed to be concerned about. "Linda, Robert, I was grieving the loss of my life partner of 47 years. I needed support, patience, and encouragement while I figured out who I was as an individual. Instead, you treated my normal grief response as evidence of incompetence and used it to justify taking control of my life. But we were trying to help. You were trying to help yourselves feel important and needed. My independence threatened your sense of being necessary, so you worked systematically to undermine it." Linda shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, we never meant to hurt you. Intent doesn't matter when the impact is harmful. You abandoned me at an airport because you were convinced I couldn't survive without you. That cruelty gave me the motivation to prove you wrong in the most public way possible." Over the following months, Linda and Robert slowly began to adjust to having a mother who wouldn't accept their supervision or control. It wasn't easy for them. They had become accustomed to feeling important and needed in my life, and my independence left them uncertain about their role. But gradually, they began to develop a healthier relationship with me based on respect rather than control. Linda started asking about my travel plans with genuine curiosity rather than concern. Robert began sharing details about his own life instead of focusing on managing mine. Carol took longer to adjust, occasionally making comments about my risky behavior. But even she eventually learned that her medical opinions about my lifestyle choices weren't welcome unless I specifically requested them. The grandchildren, Jake and Emma, were initially confused by the change in family dynamics, but they quickly adapted to having a grandmother who was active, confident, and interesting, rather than someone who needed their careful consideration. "Grandma, you're so cool now," Emma said during one of our regular coffee dates, a tradition I'd established to rebuild our relationship on my terms. "I love hearing about your adventures." "I'm the same person I always was, sweetheart. I just stopped letting other people convince me I wasn't capable of having adventures." 2 years after my Paris trip, I was living a life I couldn't have imagined when my children abandoned me at that airport. I had traveled to 12 countries, written a best-selling book, spoken at conferences around the world, and built a community of seniors who were reclaiming their independence from controlling families. I had also found love again with William, and we were planning a wedding for the spring, much to Linda and Robert's initial dismay, though they eventually came to accept that my happiness was more important than their concerns about men who prey on elderly widows. My relationship with my children had evolved into something healthier and more honest. They no longer treated me as a problem to be managed, and I no longer sought their approval for my life choices. We had genuine conversations about books, politics, and family history instead of lectures about my supposed limitations. Most importantly, I had learned that age is just a number, independence is a choice, and the only person whose approval you truly need is your own. On the second anniversary of my airport abandonment, I posted a final TikTok video from the same terminal where my transformation had begun. 2 years ago, my children left me at this airport thinking they were teaching me a lesson about dependence. Today, I'm here by choice, heading to Tokyo for my latest solo adventure. Their cruelty taught me the most valuable lesson of my life: that I don't need anyone's permission to live fully, love deeply, and embrace every possibility life offers. At 72, I'm just getting started. The video received over 5 million views and hundreds of thousands of comments from people around the world who had been inspired to reclaim their own power, set their own boundaries, and refuse to accept limitations imposed by others. My children had wanted to teach me that I couldn't survive without them. Instead, they had taught me that I could not only survive without their approval, I could flourish beyond anything I had ever imagined possible. The abandoned elderly woman sitting in that airport terminal 2 years ago had become a best-selling author, international speaker, and symbol of independence for seniors worldwide. More importantly, she had become someone who knew her worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions of her capabilities. Linda and Robert had given me the greatest gift of my life by showing me exactly how little I needed their validation. And for that, despite everything, I would always be grateful. At 72 years old, I was finally free to be exactly who I was meant to be. And that person was magnificent. Today, at 74, I continue to travel, write, and speak about the importance of refusing to accept artificial limitations based on age, gender, or family expectations. My story has inspired legislation in several states to better protect seniors from financial and emotional abuse by family members. The Eleanor Thompson Foundation, which I established with proceeds from my book, provides grants to seniors who want to pursue education, travel, or other dreams they've been told are inappropriate for their age. Linda and Robert have both become advocates for healthy family dynamics and better treatment of elderly parents. Linda has incorporated lessons about respecting senior autonomy into her work as a school principal, and Robert has become involved in elder rights advocacy. Most importantly, thousands of seniors have found the courage to reclaim their independence after hearing my story. They've left controlling living situations, pursued delayed dreams, and demanded to be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. My children thought they were abandoning a helpless elderly woman at an airport. Instead, they launched a movement that changed how families think about aging, independence, and respect. And I continue to live every day as proof that the best chapters of your life might be the ones you write after everyone else has decided. Your story is over. The woman they left behind was someone who needed their approval to feel worthy. The woman who emerged was someone who understood that worth comes from within, and that understanding has Mo. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Aid all the difference.